Hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive.
Yeah, hey.
You know why you're here, right? To get a handle on some of these big thinkers, some of these big ideas.
Absolutely, and to do it quickly.
Right. Like your shortcut, we're going to cut through all that dense stuff.
Get right to the good stuff.
Exactly. And today's thinker man, he's a tough one. He's a dense one. It's John Baudrillard.
It is.
Have you ever heard of this guy?
I have indeed.
Yeah.
He's kind of a tough one to pin down.
Yeah, he is. He's kind of all over the place.
He is. I think the thing that people probably know him for the most is this idea of like how we experience reality in like the modern world.
Right, in like a technological age.
Exactly.
In a post-truth age. In
So
a
hyper-real.
Yes, hyper-reality.
That's it.
So Jean Baudrillard, 1929 to 2007.
That's right.
And yeah, I mean, you try and pin a label on this guy.
It's tough.
It's tough. He's associated with postmodernism. He's associated with post-structuralism.
Yep.
Really, his ideas are just kind of all over the place.
He's all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
He's one of those thinkers who really just defies easy categorization.
Right, and that's why he's so interesting. That's why we're talking about him.
Exactly, and he really does offer a really unique and I think critical perspective on a lot of, especially like modern culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And so today we are drawing mostly from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Baudrillard.
Yes.
So imagine you're listening to this and you are a
King philosopher.
king philosopher who's interested in
truth, justice, and the...
right, reality, society, power, all this
Yep.
stuff, but maybe you're coming at it from kind of a less conventional perspective, right?
Absolutely, and I think that's what's so fascinating about Baudrillard is he offers these like really different ways of thinking about those kind of foundational ideas about society and reality.
Right. So we're going to try and pull out some of the key insights that we think would be really intriguing to a king philosopher.
Exactly.
Even if his approach is a little bit, as I've said, unconventional.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about some really kind of surprising elements of his thought, like his kind of critique of Marxism.
Yeah, his aristocratic critique of Marxism.
Yeah, his idea of simulation, which is so central to his work.
It really is kind of his bread and butter.
Yeah, and then later on this idea of the triumph of the object, which is really fascinating.
Yeah, it gets really metaphysical.
It does. It gets really heady.
He does.
So yeah, are you ready to dive in?
Let's do it.
Let's do it. So this guy, his thinking really comes out of some other really interesting critiques from the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the first one I want to mention is Henri Lefebvre.
Yeah, Lefebvre.
Who really looked at everyday life.
Yeah, he was really one of the first to really try to theorize, like, what does it mean to live in this everydayness?
Yeah, like that's the texture of our existence.
Exactly. And how is that produced? And, like, what are the social forces that shape that?
Right. And then we also have Roland Barthes.
Yes, the semiotician.
The semiotician.
Extraordinaire.
Yeah, who was really looking at the meaning in signs and symbols.
Yeah, and how these signs and symbols don't just represent things, but they actually construct meaning.
Right, like they don't just reflect reality. They are
constitutive.
Yeah, they make up reality.
Exactly.
And so Baudrillard's thought kind of emerges out of this milieu.
Yeah, he really takes up these ideas and starts to kind of forge his own path.
Yeah. So he really, in his early career, he's doing a lot of work in sociology and what's called semiology.
Which is the study of science.
Yeah, exactly. And even psychoanalysis.
Yeah, the workings of the mind.
So this period, I mean, we're talking late 60s, early 70s. This is where he produces some of his most important works.
Right. So he's got like the system of objects.
The Consumer Society.
For a critique of the political economy of the sign.
Yeah, that's a mouthful.
It is. It's a bit of a mouthful.
And it's in these books that he starts to develop some of his key concepts.
Absolutely.
So one of the key concepts he introduces that's really important for understanding his work is this idea of sign value. So how does that differ from kind of more traditional Marxist ideas about value, like use value, exchange value, all that stuff?
Okay, so traditionally, like if you're thinking about Marx, Marx is really focused on use value, which is like what a product does, what its function is.
Like a hammer's nails.
Exactly. Hammer's nails, and then exchange value, which is like what you can trade it for in the market.
Right.
So like how much money is it worth?
Okay.
But Baudrillard comes along and he says, look, in our consumer society, there's this third kind of value that's becoming increasingly dominant, and that's sign value.
So what is that?
So sign value is basically the status, the prestige, the identity that we associate with things. Right. So it's not just what it does or how much money it's worth. It's like, What does it say about me when I own this thing?
Yeah, it's the story it
It's
tells.
the story it tells, exactly.
So this sounds a lot like that idea of conspicuous consumption that Thorstein Veblen talked about, like buying a Rolex just to show off your wealth.
It's exactly that. And Baudrillard takes that idea and he kind of blows it up and says this is actually a fundamental organizing principle of our entire society now,
Wow, okay.
right? So he says society increasingly is structured around this consumption and display of goods specifically for their sign value.
So it's not even about having stuff anymore, it's about what that stuff says about you.
Exactly. It's about the image it projects.
Okay.
And so that's a really key idea for understanding a lot of his later work.
Right now, early on, Baudrillard, he's associated with the French left.
Right.
He was even involved in the events of May 1968, which was like this big student worker uprising.
Yeah, a big moment of social upheaval.
Huge moment. But he eventually becomes pretty critical of Marxism.
He does. He really kind of breaks with Marxism in a pretty significant way.
So what was the turning point for him there?
Yeah, so there's a lot of kind of debate about exactly when this break happened and why. But one of the key texts that kind of marks this shift is his book, The Mirror of Production.
The mirror of production.
Yeah, and in that book, he makes this really provocative argument that Marxism, even though it critiques capitalism, it's still trapped within the same basic framework. Right, so by focusing on production, by making production like the center of human activity and social organization, Marx is essentially mirroring the capitalist obsession with output and efficiency.
So he's still thinking in terms of material goods?
Exactly. He's still thinking in terms of the economy.
Right.
And Baudrillard says that's not radical enough. We need to think beyond production.
So if production's not the key, then what is?
Yeah, so this is where this idea of symbolic exchange comes in.
Ooh, that sounds a little bit abstract.
It is a bit abstract.
So how can we kind of wrap our heads around that?
Yeah, so he gets this idea from a bunch of different thinkers. Georges Bataille is a big one. Marcel Mauss, also Alfred Jarry, the kind of absurdist playwright.
Okay.
And what they're all kind of pointing to are forms of interaction and exchange that stand outside of or in opposition to that capitalist emphasis on utility and profit.
So we're talking about things that aren't necessarily useful or profitable, but they have
They have value in a different way.
value in it in a different way. Okay.
Yeah. So think about things like expenditure, right? Like waste.
Okay.
Think about the act of giving a gift where you don't expect something in return.
Right.
Or even those potlatch ceremonies where they intentionally destroy wealth.
Wow.
It seems totally irrational from an economic standpoint, but it actually serves a really powerful social function,
Right.
right? Creates social bonds. It establishes status.
So it's kind of like a different kind of economy.
It is. It's like a different kind of economy. Yeah, and Bataille actually talks about this. He calls it a general economy.
General economy.
Yeah, where things like expenditure and excess are actually more fundamental than production and accumulation.
Okay, so it's like flipping the script on traditional economics.
Exactly. And the Bataille also talks about this in his work on gift giving,
Yeah.
right? Like in pre-industrial societies, gift giving was this really important way of establishing social bonds and prestige.
Right. It wasn't about the money. It was about the relationship.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
And so Baudrillard sees in these ideas a fundamental break with that whole capitalist mindset of just accumulating more and more stuff.
Yeah.
He's like, there's a whole other way of thinking about value and exchange.
And this brings us to his idea of the postmodern break, right? This big historical shift.
That's right.
So how does symbolic exchange fit into this idea of the postmodern break?
Yeah, so he basically theorizes this kind of like historical progression, right? So he's like, pre-modern societies are organized around these principles of symbolic exchange, right? These reciprocal acts of giving and receiving that create social bonds and status. And then you have the rise of industrialization, and modern societies become dominated by production and commodity exchange.
Okay, so we shift from gift giving to just buying and selling.
Exactly. It becomes all about economic imperatives.
Got it.
And then he says we've entered this new era, this postmodern era, which is increasingly defined by what he calls simulation.
Simulation. This is a really important idea for Baudrillard, right?
It's central to his whole project.
So what does he mean by simulation?
Okay, so simulation for him is basically the way that our culture produces images, signs, models that mediate and even replace our direct experience of reality.
So
So think about TV, the internet, social media, all these things.
yeah.
They're not just reflecting a reality that's out there, they're actually creating their own kind of reality.
So it's not just that media represents reality, it's becoming a form of reality itself.
Exactly. The lines are blurring.
Okay, that's interesting.
And so this leads to what he calls the end of political economy.
The end of political economy.
Yeah, he's like that traditional way of understanding society based on production and the economy is breaking down.
Wow.
He says now it's all about social reproduction. It's about information, communication, knowledge.
It's almost like the immaterial is becoming more important than the material.
Exactly. The map is becoming the territory.
Wow, okay.
And then from there, he develops these even more like mind-bending concepts.
Right, like hyperreality and implosion.
Yeah, hyperreality is like the condition where the simulations we create become more real than real.
Than the reality they were supposed to represent.
Exactly.
So like Disneyland is a good example of that.
Yeah, Disneyland is a classic example.
Because it's a fantasy world, but it's so...
Immersive.
Yeah, it's so vivid.
And it feels so real.
That it actually shapes the way we see the real world.
Exactly.
Okay, wow, that's trippy. And then implosion, what's that about?
So implosion is basically the collapse of all these traditional boundaries that we used to have.
Okay.
So like the boundaries between social classes, between genders, between public and private, between politics and entertainment.
Right, like all those things are just kind of collapsing in on themselves.
They're imploding, exactly.
Okay, so this is a pretty radical way of seeing the world. And I know he even had some pretty intense ideas about how this affects us as individuals, right?
Oh, yeah.
So like the pure screen and the ecstasy of communication.
Right, so he sees the postmodern subject as like increasingly fragmented and like saturated by this constant bombardment of images and information.
Right, like we're just drowning in it.
We're drowning in it. And the ecstasy of communication, he calls it, isn't like this joyful connection between people.
Right, it doesn't sound very ecstatic.
No, it's more like this overwhelming proximity to it's a state of overexposure.
Okay.
Where the individual becomes almost like a pure screen, just passively absorbing all of this stuff without any real depth of engagement.
Right. It's like we're just consuming, but not really processing.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've gone from his early social critiques to this really kind of mind-blowing theory of the postmodern condition.
It's a lot.
It is a lot, but his journey doesn't end there.
No, it doesn't.
The source we're looking at, it mentions that in the 1980s, his work starts to shift again.
Yeah, it takes a bit of a turn.
Yeah, it becomes more philosophical, even literary.
Yeah, so you start to see these more abstract philosophical concepts coming in. And his writing gets a lot more like evocative and less like strictly sociological.
So what prompted the shift?
I think it's a combination of factors.
Yeah.
I mean, you have kind of the intellectual climate changing. You have Baudrillard himself kind of evolving as a thinker. But some of the key texts that mark this shift are books like Seduction.
Seduction.
And Fatal Strategies.
Fatal Strategies, okay.
And in these books, you really see him grappling with these kind of big philosophical questions about meaning and reality and the nature of the subject.
So this idea of seduction, I mean, it's an interesting word to use.
Yeah, it's a very specific way that he's using that term.
Right, so how is he using it?
So for him, seduction is kind of like this alternative to that whole bourgeois focus on production.
Okay.
He sees it as this like aristocratic order of sign and ritual
Okay.
that emphasizes artifice and appearance and the play of surfaces.
So it's kind of like a rejection of that kind of like work ethic, Protestant work ethic kind of thing?
Exactly. Yeah, he's like, there's a whole other way of being in the world that's not about just producing more and more stuff.
Right.
It's about playing with appearances. It's about seduction.
Okay, interesting. And then there's this other really kind of fascinating and maybe a little bit frightening idea that comes up in his later work, this idea of the triumph of the object.
Right. It's like the objects are taking over.
Yeah, it sounds like it. So what does he mean by that?
Yeah, so in his later work, he becomes really preoccupied with just like the sheer volume and pervasiveness of objects in the world.
Right, like we're just surrounded by stuff.
We are just absolutely inundated with objects.
Yeah.
And he says this world of objects has become so dominant, it's actually surpassing our ability to understand it.
Wow.
He's like, we're no longer in control. The objects are in control.
So it's like they've taken on a life of their own?
They have. They've developed their own logic, their own kind of agency.
And we're just kind of along for the ride.
Yeah, he calls it the ecstasy of objects.
Ecstasy of objects.
Yeah, it's this like relentless growth and expansion of the object world.
Okay.
But it's also accompanied by this kind of like inertia or passivity in the human subject.
So we're kind of mesmerized by it, but also kind of overwhelmed.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like we're both fascinated and kind of terrified.
Okay.
And this leads to his concept of fatal strategies.
Fatal strategies. What are those?
So instead of believing that we can always like master or control the objects around us through like our rational thought and planning,
Right.
He's like, maybe we should just submit to the logic of the objects.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he's like, maybe that's the only way to kind of survive in this world.
So it's almost like a kind of surrender.
It is a kind of surrender. It's a letting go of that kind of like Enlightenment idea that we're in control of the world.
Right. It's a very different way of thinking about it.
It is, and he contrasts this with what he calls banal strategies,
The null strategies.
which is like that kind of naive belief that we are always superior to and in control of the object world.
Okay, so fatal strategies is about surrendering to the objects. Banal strategies is about trying to control them.
Exactly.
Okay.
And you can see how this connects with his growing interest as Alfred Jarry and pataphysics.
Pataphysics.
Yeah, which Jarry described as the science of imaginary solutions.
The science of imaginary solutions.
Yeah, it's like this realm beyond metaphysics. It's characterized by absurdity, by reversals of logic, by the idea that objects have their own kind of rules and agency.
Okay, so it's like a very playful, but also kind of like a dark and kind of absurdist way of looking at the world.
It's very much in that vein.
Yeah.
Baudrillard is kind of trying to tap into that.
Okay, so he's really trying to move beyond that traditional philosophical focus on the thinking subject.
Yeah, he's like, it's not about the subject anymore, it's about the object.
And this is where we get that idea of the reign of the object, right?
Exactly, yeah. He's like, we've entered this new era where the objects are in charge.
Wow.
And then this idea of like imminent reversal comes in as well.
Imminent reverse.
Right, which is the idea that things tend to turn into their opposite.
Okay.
So like liberation can actually lead to new forms of servitude. Power dynamics can shift in unexpected ways.
So it's like this kind of like a twist on traditional dialectical thinking.
It is. It's like progress isn't always linear. It can kind of like loop back on itself.
Right.
And he sees this happening all over the place in society and culture.
So even as his thinking is getting more abstract, more philosophical, he's still very much engaged with the world.
Oh, absolutely. He's still a public intellectual.
Right. He's writing for newspapers. He's keeping journals.
Yeah, he's writing for Liberation, which is a French newspaper.
Okay.
And he's keeping his Cool Memories journal,
Cool memories.
which are full of these like really provocative and sometimes controversial reflections on all sorts of current events.
Right. So he's not just theorizing in the abstract, he's applying his ideas to the real world.
Exactly.
Okay. And in his later philosophical work, he also talks about this impossible exchange.
Yes.
So what's that about?
Yeah. So this is a really important theme for him. It's this idea that there's always this gap between our concepts and the world,
Right.
between our theories and reality.
Okay, so like the map is never the territory.
The map is never the territory, exactly.
Okay.
And he becomes increasingly skeptical that we can ever really bridge that gap.
So it's kind of like a limit to knowledge?
It is. It's a limit to knowledge, yeah.
Yeah.
And he even starts to entertain the idea of embracing illusion and meaninglessness.
Wow.
He's like, maybe if we could just accept the fact that there's no ultimate meaning out there,
Right.
we could find a certain kind of freedom.
Freedom from what?
Freedom from the need to find meaning. Freedom from the need to, like, make sense of everything.
Okay, so it's almost like a kind of nihilism, but maybe not in a negative way?
Yeah, that's playful nihilism, I guess you could say.
Interesting.
Yeah, and he even goes so far as to identify with what he calls the principle of evil.
The principle of evil.
Yeah, which is like the force that opposes the dominant good.
Okay, so it's kind of like a contrarian impulse.
He's always pushing back against whatever the established truth is.
Okay.
And this brings us to this really fascinating idea of theory fiction or anticipatory theory.
Theory fiction, so it's like he's blurring the lines between theory and fiction.
Exactly. Yeah, he's saying that theory needs to become more like fiction in order to grasp this kind of crazy reality that we're living in.
Right, because reality is already stranger than fiction.
Exactly.
Okay.
And he sees his own work as kind of like an attempt to simulate or anticipate events that are unfolding so rapidly that they kind of like outstrip our existing ways of understanding them.
So he's trying to get ahead of the curve.
He's trying to be a futurist in a way.
Right, but his track record as a political analyst wasn't perfect. Right?
Yeah. I mean, there were definitely some hits and misses.
The source mentions the Berlin Wall.
Yeah, he famously thought that the Berlin Wall was going to be around for a lot longer than it was.
Right.
And then it came down and he was kind of like, oh, okay.
Whoops.
So yeah, he wasn't always right. But even when he was wrong, his analyses were always really provocative and interesting.
Right. It's more about asking the right questions than getting the right answers.
Exactly.
Okay.
And he did offer some really interesting perspectives on globalization.
Right.
He saw it as this kind of like homogenizing force
Okay.
that kind of crushes singularity and individuality.
So he wasn't a big fan of globalization?
No, he was pretty critical of it.
Okay.
He saw it as part of this kind of like broader trend of the world becoming more and more simulated and less real.
Right. And this brings us back to that central idea of the disappearance of the real.
Yeah, which he famously called the perfect crime.
The perfect crime.
Yeah, it's like the ultimate vanishing act.
So for him, the real is disappearing because it's being replaced by all these simulations.
Exactly. It's like we're living in a world of copies without an original.
Wow. That's kind of a bleak outlook.
It is. It's a little bit bleak, but I think it's also a really important provocation.
Right. Like it's making us question what we even mean by reality. So to kind of wrap things up, Jean Baudrillard, he was a real intellectual provocateur.
He was.
He challenged a lot of our assumptions about society, reality, power.
Yeah, he really shook things up.
And his work, I mean, it's definitely challenging. It's complex. It's open to a lot of different interpretations.
Absolutely.
But it's definitely worth grappling with.
I think so, too.
Especially for anyone who's interested in these kind of like fundamental philosophical questions.
Right.
So for you listening out there, if you're a king philosopher looking for some alternative perspectives,
Baudrillard is your guy.
Baudrillard is definitely worth checking out. He's
Yeah.
going to make you think, he's going to make you question everything you thought you knew.
Absolutely.
And that's a good thing.
It is.
So this has been a really, I think, fascinating deep dive into the work of Jean Baudrillard.
It has been.
We've only scratched the surface, obviously.
Yeah, there's so much more to explore.
But hopefully this has given you a little bit of a taste of his thinking.
A little appetite.
Yeah,
An appetizer, and maybe inspired you to go out and learn more.
absolutely.
So one final thought to leave you with.
Okay.
Considering everything we've talked about today,
Yeah.
this idea of the triumph of the object, this idea of simulation,
Right.
how might a philosopher who's traditionally concerned with truth and reality,
Yeah.
how might they navigate a world that's increasingly defined by images, by technology, by simulated experiences?
It's the question of our time.
It's a huge question. And what are the implications for knowledge, for governance, even for our understanding of what it means to be human in this kind of hyper-real landscape?
Yeah, those are the big questions
Those are the big ones.
that Baudrillard leaves us with.
And we encourage you to go out and wrestle with those questions yourself.
Yes.
Read Baudrillard. Read the people who are writing about him.
Yeah,
Come to your own conclusions.
exactly.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.
See ya.